wanted to explore relationships with other men after our marriage. When I asked my husband, he did this. Hey everyone, I really messed up. There was a time when I had the only man I ever loved by my side, but I let my own selfish ideas drive him away. It pains me to think about the hurt I caused him, but what truly stings is the fact that he walked away. I found myself wishing he had stayed, hoping we could navigate through my mistakes together. I often find myself wishing he had taken a moment to correct me instead of just walking away. The disappointment lingers, a heavy weight on my heart. I had everything: a friend, a caring partner, a gem of a husband. Yet, in a moment of weakness, I chose to throw it all away for something that turned out to be so meaningless. At the age of 19, I crossed paths with my husband, who was just a couple of years older at 21. It was at the library where our paths first crossed. Before him, I had never experienced a relationship, not even gone out on a date. I often found myself keeping to my own thoughts, focused on my studies at university. I was determined not to let distractions pull me away from my goals. He first approached me at the shelves, casually mentioning how he had noticed me around and thought I was beautiful. He asked if we could get to know each other better and if he could have my number. I turned him down clean immediately. There I was, standing there, feeling a mix of uncertainty and reluctance. I just couldn't bring myself to give him my number. The thought of getting to know anyone in the school felt overwhelming, and I preferred to keep my distance. I had this vision of simply gliding through my college years, picking up my degree with ease, and moving on to the next chapter of my life. As the months passed, I noticed him making his way to our table, where my friends and I would gather, and he would pull up a chair to join us. There were times when he would show up with a novel in hand, ready to dive into another world. But then there were those other days, the ones I cherished, when he would leave the book behind, and instead immerse himself in lively conversations with my friends, sharing laughter and stories that filled the air with warmth. Before long, I found myself getting used to his presence each day. I would catch him watching me as I read, and I noticed the way he engaged effortlessly in conversation with my friends. There was a day when he just didn't come around. Feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach, I turned to my friends, the ones I always shared a table with at the library. I asked them if they had heard anything, but each of them shook their heads, their expressions mirroring my concern. When I reached out, the only response I got was, "You know his life does not revolve around you, right? He's probably tired of waiting on you and has gone back out." At that moment, I couldn't understand why those words stung so deeply, but as time passed, the reason became clear. As I navigated my feelings, I realized I was slowly falling for him. Hearing that he might have moved on felt like a sharp sting in my heart. After not seeing him the next day, I felt a growing concern. I turned to my friends, hoping they might have his number so I could check in on him. Maybe he was unwell or even in the hospital. But when I asked, they all looked at me with regret, explaining that none of them had taken his number because I had specifically asked them not to. It was a strange mix of worry and frustration that settled in my chest. Isn't that strange? He returned the very next day, just like he always did. He strolled in with his friends, said his goodbyes, and headed directly to the shelves. As he reached for a CIT 301 textbook from the shelves, I watched him make his way towards us. I can still picture that moment vividly. It was the first time I truly took an interest in the books he chose to read. "Hey, what happened to you? I didn't see you for 2 whole days," I remarked as he settled into his seat at our table. "Oh, she speaks," he said, and in that moment the table erupted with laughter. "I'm really serious, you know. It's been 2 days since I last saw you, and I was starting to get worried," I said, removing my glasses. For what felt like the first time in ages, I locked eyes with him, really looked him dead in the eyes. He looked at me, his expression shifting from surprise to a smirk that played on his lips. There was something about him that caught my eye. He was incredibly handsome, almost as if he had stepped right out of a cartoon. I found myself reflecting on why it took me so long to notice it. He had an average build, but his profound gorgeousness more than made up for it. His blue eyes were like deep oceans, drawing you in and making it easy to forget everything else. Despite standing at just 5'9", he carried himself with a presence that felt much larger than life. His voice was deep and raspy, carrying a weight that seemed to resonate with every word he spoke. There was a moment when I held him close, and his voice resonated through me, sending vibrations to every part of my being. It might seem trivial, but it's those little silly moments that I find myself longing for at this very moment. "You? Worried about me?" he asked after a brief pause. "I would believe you, but I'm not even sure you know what my name is," he added with a smirk. Without missing a beat, I replied, "Stanley." My friends at the table erupted in laughter once more. "You see, you don't even know my name," he chuckled, joining in on the fun. "That's a nickname I got from junior high that has stuck with me all the way to now." "It's not Stanley, it's Stan Lee," he said, a hint of pride in his voice, like the owner of Marvel Comics. He got up and changed tables, settling into solitude. I had never witnessed him in the library before, nor had I ever seen him alone. A pang of guilt washed over me. It felt as if I had caused him some pain simply by not knowing his name. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had hurt him. I found myself stealing glances his way, biting my nails, and wishing he would return to our table, or, at the very least, glance back at me. He lost himself in the books he pulled from the shelf for the next 3 hours. With exams looming, it made sense for him to focus, but a part of me wondered if I was the reason he needed to escape into those pages. "You know, if you miss him that much, you should just go talk to him," my friend Sophia suggested, her words lingering in the air. Should I really go talk to him? No way, I thought as I adjusted my glasses and returned to my books. I had grasped so much from the pages in front of me, and this was my final stop on the journey of exam preparations. Yet the thought lingered in my mind as I flipped through the chapters. Finally, I decided to give in. With a deep breath, I stood up and made my way to the table where he sat. "Come back, I'm sorry," I said, and he would later describe it as the cutest anime-style apology ever. He looked up at me, raising an eyebrow, the familiar gesture he used when he wanted someone to repeat themselves. I took a seat at the table, right across from him. Starting a conversation felt daunting, and he could tell, so he reassured me that it was nothing. He wasn't angry or anything. Still, I could sense his disappointment that I didn't know his name. He shared with me how he chose to sit alone, feeling the weight of a test he needed to prepare for. The lecturer, he said, was known for being strict and not generous with grades. He expressed his urgency to pass the course, fearing the consequences of being held back another year. Then, with a hint of a smile, he mentioned that while he could have stayed at the table, he figured it would be better to spend his time looking at me instead of studying. So I asked, "What's your name then?" I asked. He set the book aside and turned to me, a big smile on his face. "Danielle, meet Daniel," he said, extending his hand for a shake. I had always believed that Danielle and Daniel made the perfect couple name, and I still do. I just can't figure out why I let this get out of hand. I got up to leave, and he reached for my hand. In that moment, I felt a jolt that shook me to my core, and I couldn't help but laugh a little. "If you'd like to be somewhere other than here, I'd like to take you out tomorrow after my test," he said. Inside, I was overjoyed that he had asked me on a date. I realized that if he had asked me earlier, I probably would have turned him down without a second thought. But now, here I was, flustered and feeling those familiar butterflies in my stomach for this young man. Honestly, there are moments when I find myself wishing for a time machine. If only I could go back, I would change so many things. I would have listened to him more, made a greater effort to bring him joy. I would have set aside my own needs. Now, I sit here, pouring my heart out to strangers, tears flowing as I remember the beautiful moments I had with my Daniel. Our date was nothing short of splendid. He had this incredible sense of humor and a wealth of interesting things to share, each one more meaningful than the last. His charisma was undeniable, and I couldn't help but notice the jealous glances from other girls as we enjoyed our time together. At one point, he mentioned that he was the runner-up for Mr. UCLA, and I thought to myself, rightfully so. It was hard to imagine anyone more handsome than him. Looking back at our time at UCLA, it feels like a whirlwind, reminiscent of a high school romance novel. He was the life of the party, always invited to the best events, and I was right there with him, hand in hand. We were truly inseparable, and in his final semester, we were even crowned the most influential couple. I have to admit, it was mostly due to him, Before we started dating, I was just a face in the crowd, but together we made quite the impression. He was my first everything, my first date, my first kiss, my first love. I realized I wasn't his first in the same way. Everything we shared, he had experienced before, except for marriage. He was always so cool with me, patiently explaining things I struggled to grasp, never quick to anger. Looking back, I can't help but think I was a foolish girl. There was a time when I found myself constantly measuring our intimate moments against some imaginary scale. I couldn't shake the feeling of dissatisfaction that came from knowing he was the only one on my list. It stirred a desire within me for bragging rights, a sense of validation. I convinced myself that wanting to explore connections with others was a sensible approach, a way to balance things out in my mind. Months after our wedding, I found myself contemplating the idea of opening up our marriage. I had cautiously broached the subject before, but his immediate dismissal left me feeling like I might lose him if I pursued it further. I vividly recall one day asking him how he would react if we decided to explore this option. His response was blunt and unexpected. "I'll walk the fuck out, no questions asked." There was a fire inside me, a frustration that bubbled up every time I thought about how he seemed to want to hold me back. It felt so unfair, especially since he had his share of freedom before we became a couple. After a few months of wrestling with my thoughts, I mustered the courage to bring it up again, only to receive the same response. That moment crystallized my decision. I would wait until after we said our vows. I believed that once we were married, he might finally understand where I was coming from. When we finally exchanged vows, I felt a surge of determination to embrace my desires. I recognize now that it was a bit selfish of me, marrying him with the intention of exploring my sexuality while holding on to the love we shared. I had finally secured our bond, and with that, I felt free to pursue what I truly wanted. I often find myself reflecting on the moments I took for granted, especially when he opened up about his feelings. I remember how his words seemed to drift away, unheard and unacknowledged, and now I carry the weight of regret for letting my one true love slip through my fingers. They say opportunities are fleeting, and I realize all too late that I lost my chance at being loved for who I truly am. Years have passed since I lost Daniel, and in that time, I've searched for someone who could treat me with the same kindness he did. Yet, no one has come close to the depth of love he offered me. Our honeymoon was supposed to be a beautiful 4-month adventure, a culmination of 5 years of love and commitment, but as the days unfolded, I found myself grappling with a secret that had been brewing for 3 years. The thought of being with someone other than my husband lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over what should have been a blissful escape. I imagined wild scenarios, even picturing myself in our honeymoon suite, indulging in fantasies while my husband looked on. It was a confusing time, and I felt like I was losing myself in desires that felt so foreign to the love we had built together. There was this undeniable push that led me down a dark path, and that push had a name: Tom. He towered over everyone at 6'5", a true giant in every sense. With muscles that spoke of countless hours spent in the gym, he always chose clothes that showcased his hard work, making it impossible to ignore his presence. I've always been a pretty tall lady, standing at 6'1". The men in my life, whether at work or in my personal circles, were usually around my height or even shorter. So you can imagine the thrill that ran down my spine when I met someone who made me feel small for the first time. He came to my workplace as a transfer, landing right above me in the hierarchy. This meant I had to report to him every day. He was in his 30s, older than both me and my husband. Well, my ex-husband now. He had this flirtatious charm about him, his soft-spoken words wrapping around me like a gentle caress, as if he were always trying to draw me in. Each day, as I reported to him, I found it challenging to maintain my professionalism, all the while feeling a rush of excitement from the subtle things he did that stirred something deep within me. Then one day, he asked me to grab drinks with him. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Was he flirting with me, or was he simply being friendly? Did he have feelings for me, or was he just aware of my crush and decided to take advantage of it? These questions swirled in my mind, but I never stopped to consider how my dear Daniel might feel, or the pain I could cause him. It was one of those evenings when we decided to grab drinks at a bar near the office. I found myself indulging a bit more than I usually would, and soon our conversation took a turn, drifting from casual small talk to topics that felt a bit too intimate for the setting. I opened up about my desires, expressing how I longed to be more than just one man's woman. I shared my thoughts on how many women would happily swap places with me, yet all I craved was a taste of something different, a bit of E. I shared my deepest thoughts with him, revealing my desire to open up my marriage in search of sexual liberation, free from guilt. I even confessed my crush on him. When he asked if I had talked to my husband about it, I admitted that I had. I explained that my husband didn't share my perspective and had made it clear he would leave if I pursued this path. Tom then said something that struck a chord with my foolishness. I must admit that at that moment, I was searching for anything to relieve me of the burdens of my frivolities. I think you should stop saying it like you're asking him and start saying it like you're telling him. I think it's better he opened up the marriage for you to have your fun than for you to do things behind his back. I swear to God, Tom was the epitome of bad decisions. He was the kind of guy who always seemed so confident in his terrible advice, insisting it was what I needed. Looking back, I realize he was just trying to get closer to me. That night, he treated me like I was the queen of the universe. It was a feeling I was used to from Daniel, but experiencing it from someone new made me feel like a teenager again. We said our goodbyes after sharing a kiss, a moment that lingered in my mind. As I walked through the door, I found my husband dozing in the sitting room, likely having waited for me to come back from work. I tiptoed past him, making my way to the bathroom to wash away the remnants of the night. A quick shower and brushing my teeth helped me shed the lingering scent of alcohol. I felt a bit tipsy, but it was manageable. I gently shook him awake, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. I needed to share something important with him. He looked at me with that familiar spark in his eyes and mentioned he had something exciting to share as well, but insisted I go first. As I spoke, his beautiful smile lit up the room, but I watched as it slowly faded away. Still, I felt a sense of resolve. I had already convinced myself that I was making the right choice. I want to share something important with you. I've made the decision to move forward with this, and it would mean a lot to me to have your support. It's hard for me to come to terms with the idea that you have so much more experience than I do. It leaves me feeling like maybe you had to settle for me, and I really don't want to be that girl, the one who is just a fallback. I long for the kind of desire and admiration from other men that you once shared with women before our paths crossed. It feels like happiness is just out of reach, and I know deep down that I won't find it unless I take this step. We decided to open the marriage, and that was that. That was the moment I spoke those hurtful words to the only man who truly loved me. Despite everyone else calling me a Warrand, a nickname I earned in university, a blend of weird and nerd. He was the one who made those names fade into the background, the one who finally gave me a taste of the attention I had always longed for. Those words are etched in my memory, and every time I revisit that moment, tears fill my eyes. I can't help but wonder what kind of foolish young woman I was back then. He looked me in the eyes for a while, then bowed his head as though defeated. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick, and it felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. "Well, you've said your piece, so I guess that's that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He rose and walked towards the bedroom, and as he left, I couldn't help but ask what it was he wanted to tell me. He shrugged it off, saying it was nothing, and that he was just tired from brainstorming too much at the office. The following day, I found myself in my boss's embrace. That morning, we shared a moment of intimacy in his office, and it felt like the start of something new. Tom was just the first of many encounters I would have with someone who wasn't Daniel. Fridays became a routine where I would join my coworkers at their usual TGIF hangout, and more often than not, I would wake up the next Saturday next to a stranger, someone I had never met before and would never see again. There was a time when I found myself lost in a whirlwind of choices, and my dear Daniel was there, enduring it all. I understood it was just a phase, a journey I would eventually outgrow, but I had no idea what I would have to sacrifice to find clarity. Each day, or sometimes every other, I was caught up in the thrill of new encounters, exploring different connections. 2 months later, as I was preparing for work, Tom showed up at my house. He was meant to pick me up, believing my husband would have left for his job early, as he usually did. I figured this was the perfect chance to sneak in a few rounds before we headed to the office together. As I stood in the shower, the sound of water cascading around me, I heard the door creak open. My husband Daniel was welcoming Tom, who stood there with a bouquet of flowers in hand. I couldn't catch their conversation, but when I stepped out, I found them sharing light-hearted banter. Daniel, with a playful grin, quipped, "So you're the guy that screws my wife while I screw the light bulbs." It was a moment that lingered in the air, filled with laughter and an unexpected twist of humor. Daniel had always been a mystery to me, a man of few emotions. Anger, pain, disappointment, sorrow, none of it ever seemed to touch him. You could never quite read him. All you'd get was a smile or a frown. So when he started making those jokes, I genuinely believed he was completely fine with our open marriage. He even surprised me by holding the door open as I climbed into Tom's car. Looking back, my youthful innocence blinded me to the deep pit I was digging for our relationship. As we drove to the office, Tom couldn't help but crack jokes about how my husband was handling the whole open marriage situation. He teased about my husband possibly being a cuck and playfully suggested, "Hey, if he wants to watch, that can be arranged." It was all in good fun, but I couldn't shake the mix of amusement and discomfort that washed over me. It was a Friday, a day that usually meant heading out with my coworkers after a long week, but this time was different. Instead of the usual routine, my boss Tom and I decided to book a hotel with glass windows that offered a stunning view of the city's vibrant nightlife. That night, we shared an intimate connection that changed everything. The Saturday after, I returned home. As I opened the door, an unusual stillness enveloped me. The house felt different, almost too quiet. My husband and I had a routine of never working on Saturdays, and he would always fill the morning air with his favorite songs blasting from the speaker. Even during those late nights when I came home from work or one of my escapades, he would still play his music at full volume, filling the space with life and sound. I stepped into our built-in gym, expecting to find him on the treadmill, just like he was every Saturday. But he wasn't there. A little puzzled, I wandered into the kitchen, hoping he had at least brewed some coffee, a ritual he never missed. As I glanced at the counter, my favorite cup caught my eye, and a smile crept onto my face. It was a small reminder of the life we had built together since moving in 3 years ago, just before our 2-year marriage began. I lifted the cup to take a drink, but it was empty. As I opened it, I discovered an enveloped letter tucked inside. The contents of that letter have faded from my memory, yet I still hold on to it. It serves as a reminder of how I let something so beautiful slip away, all because I was chasing after more fleeting connections. The disappointment in myself is heavy. I've stumbled through many silly mistakes over the years, but letting Daniel go like that stands out as the most foolish decision I've ever made. I went and retrieved the letter from the envelope. I left it in the cup where he had placed it, a cup that, after more than 5 years, still carries his scent within. The note read, "Hey, I hope you're doing well. There was a moment when I realized you might be curious about the absence of Smooth Criminal playing through the speakers at this very moment. By the time you read this, I will likely have arrived in South Africa. My company is launching a 5-year program aimed at nurturing the best computer-literate minds in Africa. So, for the next 5 years, I'll be calling South Africa home. But don't worry, I still remember everything about your infidelity. When I return, we will begin the process of divorce. I wonder if all those choices you made, including Tom's, really brought you the balance you were looking for. When you said that, I honestly thought you were just joking around. But yesterday really opened my eyes and showed me that you were serious all along. Looking back, I can't help but feel a sense of regret about our connection. Looking back, I often think about how different things might have been if I had walked away the first time you turned me down. You've brought so much heartache over the years, and I can't pretend otherwise. Honestly, I don't wish you well." Alongside the note was a flight ticket dated for that Saturday, June the 7th, 2014, and a passport that belonged to me. On the back of the flight ticket, a note read, "Remember the news I mentioned 2 months ago? This was it for me. It was exciting to learn that my company would be sponsoring our stay in South Africa. They were also willing to give me a job. At the bottom of the cup lay his wedding ring. It felt like my entire world had crumbled right before my eyes. I found myself fixated on that cup, unable to eat or drink, just lost in thought. The day dragged on, and what followed was a long, heavy year of depression as everything I knew began to unravel. The very next day, Elias, Tom's best friend, came by to collect all of Tom's things. I remember crying so hard, feeling the weight of the loss wash over me. I stood there, watching as he and the movers he had hired carefully packed up all of Tim's belongings. Each item felt like a piece of my own heart, having grown to hold so much sentimental value over time. Elias, in a moment of kindness, had given me a box filled with Tom's cologne and his favorite hoodie. But then, the very next day, he returned to reclaim it, leaving me with a bittersweet feeling. He walked in that day, and I was still in the same outfit I had worn to work on Friday. It felt like he practically yanked the hoodie from my grasp. I was so drained from crying for more than 24 hours that I couldn't muster the strength to resist. Elias shot me an angry look and said, "Stan Lee told me what you did." In that moment, I felt a wave of disappointment wash over me. It was as if the weight of the world had settled on my shoulders, and I couldn't help but think about the impact of those words. The thought that someone could feel that way about me was haunting, and I knew I would carry that sentiment with me for a long time. Regret lingered in the air, a reminder of the choices made and the paths taken. He set off on a quest for the cologne, picking them up along the way. As he stepped out of the house, he couldn't help but mutter, "If not for the laws of the country, I would have spat in your face." Do you notice how this room feels? I wish for your life to be filled with sadness and emptiness. Ella was never one to hold back. He had a way of speaking that was as straightforward as it gets, always laying his thoughts bare for everyone to see. If he liked you, you knew it. If he didn't, he made that clear too. Back then, his words stung, but now they cut even deeper. Since my beloved half walked away, the house feels perpetually sad and empty, echoing with the silence of what once was. I found myself desperately trying to immerse in anything or anyone, hoping to distract myself from the pain of losing my lover. Just a week after everything fell apart, Tom was transferred again, this time at his own request. I couldn't help but ask him why he wanted to leave, believing we were building something meaningful together. His response was blunt and cutting. He was moving away from me. He said he had had his fun and it was time for him to move on. He even suggested I close my marriage. My next boss was incredibly strict, and it didn't take long for me to feel the weight of his expectations. I found myself being questioned about my mistakes, which seemed to pile up as I struggled with my own instability. The situation only worsened when I realized that my personal life was under scrutiny, and soon enough, I was let go. The fallout didn't stop there. My parents, deeply rooted in their faith, and both ministers at the church I had attended since childhood, turned their backs on me. They had heard from Elias about what had transpired, and in their eyes, I had become someone they could no longer associate with. Their words stung deeply, as they labeled me a disgrace, someone who had thrown away her marriage for fleeting moments of affection, leaving me feeling utterly alone in my turmoil. Closure was something I never found. I held on to my old phone number, hoping that Tom would eventually reach out to me. 5 years slipped by, each one feeling heavier than the last, and still, there was silence. Not a word from him, not even a whisper of news about his return. In a moment of desperation, I tried to contact Elias, only to discover that he had followed Tom to South Africa a year later. One by one, my friends began to fade away, and it hit me hard. Most of them had only ever tolerated my presence. It hit me one morning that the only bright spot in my life was being part of the epic D couple. I realized I wasn't funny, and I wasn't even pleasant to be around. I discovered that I could be quite unbearable. Each of these realizations felt like a blow, pushing me further down than I ever thought possible. When Elias walked away, I didn't just return to where I started. I found myself sinking even deeper, below negative. Here I am in 2023, at 36 years old, reflecting on nearly a decade of my life. It's hard to believe that I've never experienced a relationship that lasted beyond those initial 3 months. The frustration and despair I feel are overwhelming, and there are moments when I wish I could simply drift away in my sleep. I often find myself thinking about Daniel and the way he walked out of my life, leaving me to grapple with the aftermath. I often find myself reflecting on the choices I've made, especially when it comes to love. I can't help but wish that any woman contemplating the idea of opening up her marriage might pause and reconsider. It's a path I believe leads to heartache. There are moments when I imagine walking down the street and unexpectedly running into Daniel. My heart races at the thought of finally being able to apologize, to confess that I never truly moved on. Even after all these years, a decade has passed, yet my feelings for him remain unchanged. I want to share with him the pain I caused, the regret that lingers, and how deeply I long to build a new life together. I often find myself reflecting on the choices I've made, especially when it comes to love. I can't help but wish that any woman contemplating the idea of opening up her marriage might pause and reconsider. It's a path I believe leads to heartache. There are moments when I imagine walking down the street and unexpectedly running into Daniel. My heart races at the thought of finally being able to apologize, to confess that I never truly moved on. Even after all these years, a decade has passed, yet my feelings for him remain unchanged. I want to share with him the pain I caused, the regret that lingers, and how deeply I long to build a new life together. My dating life has taken a turn for the worse. It feels like nobody wants to be with the woman who broke her husband's heart simply to seek something new. I've tried to move on, been in a few relationships, but every time the past comes up, I can see the love fade from their faces. I still live in the little bungalow that Daniel and I chose together, a cozy space we envisioned for our small family. My dating life has taken a turn for the worse. It feels like nobody wants to be with the woman who broke her husband's heart simply to seek something new. I've tried to move on, been in a few relationships, but every time the past comes up, I can see the love fade from their faces. I still live in the little bungalow that Daniel and I chose together, a cozy space we envisioned for our small family. For a long time now, I've been searching for closure. It's something I crave deeply, and I find myself yearning for his forgiveness. Life has been a struggle since I lost my job 10 years ago, and I haven't been able to find stability since then. I've been bouncing around, trying to make sense of it all, but I feel lost and in need of solace. I wish I could afford therapy, but that just isn't an option for me right now. For a long time now, I've been searching for closure. It's something I crave deeply, and I find myself yearning for his forgiveness. Life has been a struggle since I lost my job 10 years ago, and I haven't been able to find stability since then. I've been bouncing around, trying to make sense of it all, but I feel lost and in need of solace. I wish I could afford therapy, but that just isn't an option for me right now. I appreciate you taking the time to read through this lengthy story. I appreciate you taking the time to read through this lengthy story. Just wanted to share a quick update. Reflecting on the past 2 months, I wanted to share what has unfolded since my last post. It's been over 9 years since my husband, or ex-husband, depending on your perspective, walked out the door when I made the decision to open up our marriage. In that time, I've come to realize just how much I relied on him. I lost touch with everyone who once felt close to me, mostly because they adored him and seemed to only be around me out of obligation. It's a strange feeling to look back and see how intertwined our lives were and how, without him, I felt like I was left with nothing. For the first time since he left, I felt a shift in the air, a sense of hope creeping in. It was as if he had sensed my words, because not long after I shared my thoughts, my phone rang. Hearing his voice again after all this time brought a rush of emotions. I had missed that familiar raspy baritone, the way it resonated deep within me, stirring memories I thought were long buried. We talked for what felt like an eternity, and as I listened to him, the tears flowed freely. Hearing how deeply I had hurt him struck a chord within me. He shared that he couldn't fathom I would ever do something like that. At first, he thought it was just one of my late April Fool's pranks. When he recounted that moment with Tom, I could sense the pain in his voice. He felt like a part of him had died. He admitted to feeling like a fool, angry with himself for sticking around until I finally broke him. He shared with me the reasons behind his choice not to return after those first 5 years. He explained that it took him that entire time to move on from our past, and by the end of the program, he had finally begun to find happiness again. He confessed that he couldn't bear the thought of being in the same room with me, fearing it would threaten the newfound joy he had discovered. I shared my story with him, recounting the journey my life had taken. As we spoke on the phone for what felt like 2 hours, tears streamed down my face. We reminisced about the good old days, and I couldn't help but cry, realizing how much I had truly let him go. By the end of our conversation, he mentioned that he would be in the US in a week and promised to come see me at my house. He arrived at the house a week later, the weight of the divorce papers heavy in his hands. As he stepped inside, his gaze swept over the remnants of our life together, and I could feel the sadness radiating from me. The cup sat there, a silent witness, holding the letter and his ring at the bottom, a stark reminder of what once was. The rooms he had vacated still stood empty, a haunting echo of nearly a decade gone by. In that moment, for the first time, I caught a glimpse of his emotions. There it was, pity. It flickered in his eyes, and I knew he saw the depth of my despair. He leaned in, genuinely curious about my life, and I found myself sharing details I hadn't mentioned during our phone calls. When he brought up Tom, referring to him as the tall, ugly, buff man, I couldn't help but smile at the description. I recounted how Tom had come into my life, how we spent 2 months together, and then he was gone. I noticed him kiss his teeth, a gesture that seemed to echo his experiences in Africa. He shook his head, disbelief etched on his face, and asked, "So 2 months of sex was what you threw a 7-year relationship out the window for?" Then he asked me how the sex was. In all honesty, I had never experienced someone who treated me better than Daniel did in bed. He understood me completely and knew exactly how to take me where I wanted to be. Unlike all the other guys who simply wanted to come and go, he was different. It was hard to admit, but I realized I had sacrificed everything that made me who I was for something Daniel did even better than the other 14 men I had been with along the way. In a moment of compassion, he offered to cover the cost of my therapy, expressing that he had found his own way forward and believed I deserved the same. For a fleeting instant, he made me feel like I was the center of his universe, just one last time, and then he was gone. I finally finalized the divorce, and here I am, 1 month into therapy sessions, all thanks to Daniel. I can't help but feel grateful to God for bringing such a wonderful man into my life, even as I wrestle with the guilt of having ruined it. But now, it's time for me to focus on becoming a better person. It only took me 36 years to get here. I want to express my gratitude to all of you for taking the time to read this. I truly hope that nothing else will arise to pull me back into this situation. It feels like the moment has come for me to finally move forward,